Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Julie Allen, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Brett York, who has worked on drafting and publishing tax guidance at the Treasury Department for more than a decade. Brett is now a principal in PwC's merger and acquisition practice here in Washington, D.C. Brett, welcome to PwC, and welcome to your first Policy on Demand episode.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, Julie.
We're excited to have you. So Brett, before we jump into the questions, or I should say, let's get started with the questions, I want to give a little bit of background. You were at Treasury over a decade, so you were there for 11 and a half years, and you worked on around 200 projects. That's really impressive. And these projects were over the provisions of TCJA, IRA, the Jobs Act, and more. So as you look back on that time at Treasury and the projects that you worked on, what are some of the most significant projects from a taxpayer's perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for the question. I'm going to just go through a few of them
Sure.
just to show some of the different areas that I think had some major impacts on taxpayers. I worked on the REIT spin rules, which you may have run across in your practice at
Yes.
one point. The Section 163J regulations, I had the pleasure of working on those rules kind of across all subject matter areas. I worked on the anti-hybrid rules as part of TCJA. I worked on some pieces and aspects of the BEAT and GILTI regulations. I worked on CAMT. I worked on the Section 385 regulations, the IBOR regulations, and the Section 451B and C regulations that were also part of TCJA.
So Brett, while you were at Treasury, when TCJA was enacted, I want to focus on that for just a minute. You had a lot of historical knowledge of that law, and many of the Hill staffers at that time also had a lot of knowledge, but there's been some turnover with the Hill staffers. How is that going to affect the process now, and how's that also going to impact Treasury?
Yeah, I think it's going to make the process a lot more complicated next year when some of the TCJA provisions expire. It was such a complex bill that having inside knowledge on the history of how it was developed is incredibly useful. I can give you one anecdote from my Treasury experience. We lost some key high-ranking political staff that worked on the negotiations for the bill early on in the TCJ implementation process, and that caused us a great amount of difficulty. So I can only imagine that the lack of Hill staff with that inside experience will be quite difficult.
Okay, so over the course of your career at Treasury, what did you find most surprising about the regulatory process?
Yeah, I think, Julie, there were two things. The first surprising thing for me was how long it takes to draft and publish regulations. Sometimes it can take a decade or more to publish regulations, particularly if the rules are not a high priority for Treasury leadership. And these projects really rely on the tenacity of the individual staff members assigned to the project for whether they will actually be published or not. There's a large number of projects that are largely drafted and finished, but are sitting in IRS and Treasury for lack of bandwidth. That was a surprise to me. The other surprise for me was just how difficult it is to develop and publish tax guidance, even when there is a desire to publish it at a high level at Treasury, when there's political pressure to do so even. It can be quite complicated. There's a large number of stakeholders involved in the process, a large number of approvals are involved, and the best analogy I can give to you for that process is that of trying to close a large transaction. Where you have to have something work from a tax perspective, from a financial perspective, from an accounting perspective, and so on. It's a lot like that, where you have a lot of different stakeholders involved in the process that have to all agree that it works and they're good with the product. It's a lot different than just drafting a memorandum or opinion, which is actually how I imagined the process before I joined the government.
Okay, so not only were you involved in that process a lot, but you also were involved with 3 administrations. Can you give us some insight on what were the similarities and what were the differences?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there were some similarities between the Obama administration and the Biden administration. They had a bit of a focus on tax information reporting and generally some more tax gap issues. In the Obama administration, that focus was largely on FATCA, sort of foreign financial institution reporting. In the Biden administration, it was on digital asset reporting. In both cases, a lot of resources, both the Treasury and the IRS, were devoted to developing those projects and getting them published. Whereas in the Trump administration, we were sort of a singular focus on implementing TCJA because it was such a large undertaking. So there was less of a focus on those issues. there's another kind of similarity between the Obama and Biden administration I'll highlight, is that they both put a lot of resources into the Green Book, which is the sort of legislative proposals for tax matters that the Treasury Department typically issues as part of the budget. And the Trump administration really didn't issue a Green Book. They were far more focused, again, on implementing TCJ. So they had sort of more of a singular focus than the Obama and Biden administrations. Last, I think I'll note one thing that's sort of a theme that I noticed as I was in the three administrations. So late in the Obama administration, there was senior political interest in only a few tax guidance items, such as Section 385 and 7874 guidance. But in general, most tax guidance development review and so on was developed by tax experts, whether political or career staff. During the Trump administration and also the Biden administration, there's been more of a senior political interest in tax guidance, and particularly with respect to tax guidance related to major legislation, but not limited to that. They often have an interest in other tax projects. That's really a major change from how things had been done historically, and from my experience in the earlier Obama administration, which was, as I said, really a time when tax guidance was generally developed by tax experts, both political and career.
Very interesting, your point on the development of that with tax experts, the different focus on implementation. And when you bring up 385, that's one that you and I have had some discussions on, so one that we're very familiar with,
yes,
right, on the
absolutely.
different focuses. Speaking of, and 385 is right in line with this next question I'm going to ask you, is there are often concerns when you look at the tax law about the length and the complexity. And not just in reading it, but also the complexity with the IRS trying to administer and with taxpayers trying to understand that complexity. So was that a concern of Treasury when you were drafting or publishing? And how did you balance getting those rules out with also dealing with that complexity?
Yeah, Julie, it absolutely was. It's definitely a concern at Treasury. Whenever rules were developed, we tried to think about whether the rules could be administered by the IRS and ultimately by taxpayers as well. In particular, there was often a preference for developing objective rules wherever we could. This was seen as easier to implement by the IRS, and we thought would provide more clarity to taxpayers. But sometimes the statutory framework requires a high level of complexity, so that's not always something that we could eliminate. Sometimes it's just unavoidable. There are also situations, and I think 385 is a good place to bring this up, where if the government's concerned about tax planning, they may feel they need subjective rules, like subjective anti-abuse rules, for example, in order to address tax planning they may not have anticipated when drafting the objective rules. So there's a limit to how much objectivity the government can live with in some cases, particularly in those types of projects. I will note there has been a trend towards more complex rules and legislation, so I think you'll likely see more and more complex tax guidance as a result, unfortunately.
And you are right with some that we've seen roll out lately. But I will say they've done a good job taking into account the comments that we've put in too on areas where we can simplify. Last question. I'm going to come to the legislative process and the regulatory process. And we often speak with our clients about the importance of them being involved, that we want company engagement, that the government wants that insight. Is that helpful and is it effective? I think it would be great for our viewers to hear your point of view on that.
Oh, absolutely, Julie. So I think it's very effective to come to Treasury and speak to Treasury about issues you're seeing in your business. Treasury generally has an open door policy. It has for most of the time I was in the government. And so they will generally take meetings with companies and taxpayers about any issues they're seeing. And I can tell you that the staff that join those meetings take them very seriously. We often have a lot of discussions about the meetings afterwards to determine whether there is something that actually needs to be addressed, and often we do find there is. I think the other thing to note is Treasury staff that are developing tax guidance, that they don't have access to real-time factual information like you do in a company. We have tax return data, but it's often years old when we receive it and are able to process it through our economist colleagues. So we can easily miss issues that you're seeing every day in your structures. So it's very important to raise issues with Treasury as you see them so they can develop better tax guidance for everyone. I'd especially recommend reaching out to Treasury if there's an issue that's really significant to your business or seems to be progressing in a manner that is inconsistent with one would think the purpose of the related statute and regulatory regime is. I've seen several meetings of that kind that resulted in notices of revenue procedures addressing the taxpayer's issue. So it really can be impactful to reach out to Treasury with issues you're seeing. I definitely recommend reaching out to them.
And I think after spending over a decade there, your input is very important to hear about that. Brett, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today. I know this conversation is going to continue and that your insights are going to be very valuable to our viewers, so thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for joining us today. Please stay with Policy on Demand for more policy developments and continuing our post-election analysis. We appreciate you spending time with us. Take care.